Hello, and welcome to the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association Interview Series, where we meet and learn from leaders at the intersection of pharmacy and psychedelics. I'm Michael Haichin, one of the co-founders of the association. Joining me today is Dr. Cody Wenthur, an assistant professor of pharmacy and the director of the Psychoactive Pharmaceutical Investigation Master's Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks for taking the time, Cody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So to start, could you tell me about yourself, such as your career path, where you currently work, and what you do in your day-to-day role?
Absolutely. So for my career path, I am a PharmD PhD. I got my PharmD at Purdue University in 2011, and that was by virtue of misunderstanding what chemical engineering was. I thought it meant engineering new chemicals. They quickly pointed me across the street to the pharmacy school where the medicinal chemistry department was. And so I got really involved with that and also saw the clinical side and the potential for becoming a translational researcher. So that got me going. But the intention was always to go get a PhD. So after that, I moved directly into doing a PhD at Vanderbilt University in pharmacology, which I got in 2015. I was also working as a community pharmacist at that time. And then I got my postdoctoral fellowship completed at the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla in 2018. And since then, I've been here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an assistant professor in the School of Pharmacy. What I do in my day-to-day role is a combination of research, which is largely focused on neuropharmacology, perhaps entirely focused on neuropharmacology, as well as teaching in both our PharmD program, PhD program, the MS program, as you mentioned, and some clinical teaching, and then service, including service as one of the members of our new psychoactive substances research center that was launched earlier this year.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting into that specifically.
Sure.
But what led you to become interested in psychedelics, and how did you get involved with both preclinical and clinical psychedelic research?
Yeah, from the beginning, my interest in drug discovery was supported by the question of how can small molecules modify people's behavior long term? Unfortunately, the major reason that I was interested in that question was seeing individuals struggling with substance use disorders and wondering, what it is about these molecules that are changing people's, lives in such profound ways, and wanting to understand that process, which naturally led to a curiosity about are there mechanisms by which we could reverse that and have small molecules improve people's lives long term? And I got interested in the question of neuroplasticity kind of as I moved throughout my career, learning more about how the brain modifies itself and adapts to new situations over time, and psychedelics fit very nicely into that framework. As a pharmacist, I think we've often been a bit divorced from the non-drug side of psychiatry. And I think these drug-assisted psychotherapy approaches, including ketamine and now other psychedelics, are a really wonderful marriage of two important ways that patients can improve over time. I got involved with preclinical research initially during my PharmD degree, working on the serotonin transporter, then moved into work with metabotropic glutamate receptors, which are really important for modifying learning and neuroplasticity, and continue to do work preclinically in cellular and animal models on that front. And really made the choice to try and keep my hand in the clinical research space as much as possible. And in some instances, that's been human subjects research that's not, clinical trials or investigational research. But in some instances, it was. I had the opportunity to shadow Peter Martin at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center to look at polymorphisms in glutamate receptors and how that influences the risk of use disorders, and now fortunate to work with a lot of great colleagues here at UW-Madison who have ongoing clinical programs and have been able to help support those.
Right. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you are the director of the newly developed Masters of Science Psychoactive Pharmaceutical Investigation Program. How did this program come about? What has your experience been with the first cohort, and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, the program came about because we had this sort of amazing interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary even nucleus of researchers, not just at the School of Pharmacy, but across the entire University of Wisconsin. And it seemed like a great opportunity now that we're here at the cusp potentially of approval of compounds like MDMA, and maybe a few years down the line others, to provide real strong infrastructure. There's a number of good programs that have been around that are helping train psychedelic guides and facilitators, which there's definitely going to be a need for if these compounds get approved. But the space that we're especially interested in supporting are psychedelic scientists and researchers, because naturally there's been growth both in academia and in industry in trying to develop these compounds as therapeutics. And we think that in addition to standard training principles that are applied to other pharmaceutical sciences disciplines, there are some very unique features surrounding psychoactive pharmaceuticals that demand a program that gives you that information, not least of which are historical and cultural perspectives, as well as what we think are ethical imperatives for proceeding in this space in a way that both acknowledges those who've come before, but also gives back in ways that are supportive rather than extractive.
Yeah, that sounds like an absolutely fantastic program to be a part of. And so I'm curious, what has the experience been with the first cohort recently?
Yeah, we've had a really great response. So the program launched in spring of 2021, and we had our first cohort now enroll in fall of this year. We have 30 students spread across our master's program and capstone, which was great for us because we had a very short recruitment cycle. We were happy to get some very strong organic advertisement and buzz from people, which has been great. And the student cohort, I would say, is knocking it out of the park. They come from a pretty diverse set of backgrounds, but includes individuals with medical degrees, nursing degrees, pharmacy degrees, biology, chemistry, psychology, and a lot of individuals who have experience either working in healthcare settings, in the cannabis industry, or in the pharmaceutical industry, and are very excited to pivot into this new growth area. So most excited to see how these students can apply their knowledge and support the growth of this research space, and where they end up.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the potential regulatory approval of compounds like MDMA and psilocybin. So what do you envision as the future role of a pharmacist surrounding psychedelic-assisted therapy?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that's worth asking before regulatory approval, not just for these compounds, but for any compound that has a unique infrastructural need. I think with S-ketamine, Spravato, we saw the REMS program and its demands, and I think that's been somewhat onerous, yeah, and limiting for patient access. And so I think one of the things that pharmacists are going to be faced with right out of the gate, probably even today, is education of patients, right? We are the drug information experts. And so educating patients on what these drugs do, what individuals may be at greater risk when using these compounds based on their other medication use profile and or diagnoses. what the proper conditions under which they can be used safely look like, and what resources exist. For example, in the event of naturalistic use rather than prescribed use, harm reduction efforts are very important to me as someone who works in the addiction medicine space, and I think are important here. And then I think the other things that pharmacists can do are a bit more forward-looking than the traditional roles of pharmacy. One of the things that we're going to see and continue to see is a shortage of healthcare providers, particularly in rural areas of the country, away from major urban centers. And pharmacies are available, within a few miles of almost everybody. And so having well-educated professionals available in the community, potentially as sites for these psychotherapy sessions could be extremely impactful. And I think is something we want to think about as a profession, how we could potentially serve both as, knowledge infrastructure, but also physical infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities for pharmacists, both presently, as you said, for harm reduction purposes and beyond if there is that regulatory approval. Perhaps one of the most interesting questions in psychedelic drug research is how important are the subjective psychedelic effects to the potential therapeutic benefits of these compounds? And this is something that you're attempting to address with your recall of experience and conscious awareness in psilocybin treatment of depression, or RECAP study program. Could you tell me about what that is?
That program is really interdivisional and interdisciplinary effort to take someone who are healthy, normal subjects at this point in our pilot study and provide them with a dose of psilocybin that we know from our dose ranging studies and from other clinical trials will generate a psychedelic experience, which we are monitoring in real time to validate that patients are actually, subjects are actually having those experiences. And then administer boluses of midazolam sequentially during that experience at doses similar to what you might see in an outpatient procedure like a colonoscopy. So the idea is that these individuals would be awake, alert, able to respond and provide feedback, but then have amnesia for the experience. And because all of our correlational studies using tools like the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire are retrospective, and because integration is such a strong part of this therapy, what we're hoping to do with this study is to ask the very specific question is, if you don't have access to the memory of the experience as a means on which to either develop a narrative or develop insight during integration, do you still see some benefit? And I think it's a particularly fascinating question because either way it turns out, I think will be informative. There's a lot of great work being done on the fundamental biology surrounding plasticity-inducing effects of these compounds. And then there's all this very compelling correlational data, as well as people's patients and subjects' own lived experiences surrounding the content that informs the potential therapeutic benefits of the experience itself. And I think there's likely a synergy between those two things, but I also think it's incumbent upon us as scientists to challenge every assumption that we have in this field, because I think that's why the public at large is accepting of this movement at the moment, is the data is stronger than it's ever been. So we need to continue to have rock solid data on all of these questions.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone is looking forward to hearing the results of that study when that time comes. So a notable shortcoming of psychedelic clinical trials is that they have struggled to recruit participants from minority populations. Equity and inclusion in research is something that you've been very supportive of. What different research efforts are you involved in as it relates to equity in psychedelic therapy research?
Yeah, I think another very critical question for psychedelics, not just the access problem from an infrastructural standpoint, but also, from a standpoint of equity. The efforts we're most involved in right now is a study that's looking at the question of how self-identity intersects with set and setting, particularly as manifested by our dosing environment here at the University of Wisconsin. So this study is for shorthand called the POIESIS study, which it's named that way because there's these meaning making effects, right? You're taking something that wasn't there before and you're making meaning out of it. And set and setting are conceived as being this therapeutic lens through which that meaning is developed. But the other way to think about it is it could potentially actually be serving as a therapeutic filter, where the studies that we've been doing with clinical trials have been overwhelmingly white and non-representative of the population. And so the environment under which we're performing the studies may have been systematically kind of doing a random walk towards maximizing outcomes in people with that self-identity, since things like the pictures on the wall and other elements haven't been sort of rigorously studied. I think there's great research coming out on the influence of music. That's probably the most studied, but there's all these other pieces that are going into it. So that's one of the things we're looking at. And then the other is just very pragmatic, trying to, improve ourselves, trying to make sure that all of us as investigators and all of our staff are trained up to the best of our ability to be culturally competent, so that all of our research documentation and everything is accessible to folks of all backgrounds, and thereby just mitigating those potential pragmatic difficulties that some participants might face.
Yeah, no, it's an important endeavor that you guys are taking on, and hopefully it inspires other researchers to follow suit.
Yeah, we've certainly been inspired by others who've been doing great work in this space, Monnica Williams and her team, as well as others, right? And I think there's a great push in the community right now acknowledging this issue, and we'll continue to make strides.
What advice would you give to future or current pharmacists wanting to get involved in the so-called psychedelic medicine industry?
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was sort of harm reduction approaches. And I think that's a great thing that pharmacists can do right now, is educating themselves through continuing education, as well as through projects like the Fireside Project or the Zendo Project, to help their patients who may be having psychedelic experiences presently outside the context of therapeutic use. I think getting involved in the industry, the other thing that individuals can do certainly is join the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association. I think the work that you are doing as part of this group is going to be a nucleus for making the networks and the connections for pharmacists to get involved. And the third thing that I would say is to make connections interprofessionally. This space is going to demand interprofessional care. That's already been a huge theme of all of our education as medical professionals, but will only be amplified to the nth degree in this context, because as I sort of said at the outset of the interview, we're drug experts that aren't trained in psychotherapy. Likewise, psychotherapists are often not very well trained in the use of drugs. And so that cross-training, that interdisciplinarity is a huge opportunity that we can take advantage of to make a better system for our patients.
Yeah, it's certainly something that gets emphasized in school, but I don't think it has been emphasized enough within the psychedelic medicine conversation. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it is important for us to be able to have that collaboration. If you could educate people about any specific thing related to psychedelics, what would you choose?
I think the thing that I would choose from the public standpoint is that when we're talking about psychedelic use in the context of potential FDA approval and labeling for treatment of psychiatric disorders, is that the drugs are just one piece, right? That we, instead of falling to the shorthand of saying, psilocybin treats depression, or LSD could be useful for alcohol use disorder, or whatever the specific drug indication combination is, that we don't forget about that critical component that is the psychotherapy. We have tried the magic bullet pharmacologic approach for a long time now, and these drugs are obviously doing something very interesting to catalyze change, but engaging with the psychotherapy and doing the hard work is a huge component of why people are getting better, and we can't neglect to see that.
Thank you, Cody, for joining us today, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure.